Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Susanna Ecclestone. I'm the Executive Director of the British Argentine Chamber of Commerce here in London. I'm very proud to introduce this panel to you today. And we're going to be discussing the Aporte Solidario. Our three is much better than I can. And joining us this afternoon on a Friday. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Walter Kininger, our friend. Walter, thank you very much for coming today and joining us. Walter obtained his at the University of Buenos Aires School of Law and also of laws in taxation from the University in the USA. He advises Argentine and non-Argentine individuals and entities border taxation, inbound and outbound investments, M&As, business tax-free reorganization, real estate objects, strong background in company tax litigation. He has written articles in national and international publications and teaches at the University, Argentine University of the Company, UADE, and was visiting professor at the University of Florida and the University of Miami. Thank you very much, Walter, for being with us today. And we also have Raul Marcos with us from Vistra, Director of Private Wealth, and Maria Laura Ferrer, Executive Director of Vistra as well. I will be introducing their when they start talking. So we can start with you, Walter. I'm going to start sharing your presentation. Is that all right?
Yes, absolutely.
Excellent.
Okay, in the meantime, hi everybody. Good afternoon, and I don't know, it depends on where you are. I'm not in San Francisco, by the way, I'm in Buenos Aires, Argentina, but I thought it was nice, that picture, so I decided to travel at least in this way. Okay, today we're going to speak about this solidarity contribution. I think
yeah, there.
This is the beginning.
Yeah.
The Aporte Solidario, we made that translation as solidarity contribution. But before going into that new tax, I wanted to share with you some context about how we ended up being in this situation. As you might already know, Argentina enacted a very broad voluntary disclosure program, an amnesty regime, back in 2016-17. The final deadline was March 2017. It was an absolute success, meaning the money that was, or the assets and funds being reported to the tax authorities by taxpayers represented 21% of the GDP of Argentina by those times. And in addition, this is not difficult to understand, 80% of the total assets and funds being reported to the tax authorities were assets located out of Argentina. Of course, you know, we understand why Argentinians want to save or keep the money and funds and investments out of Argentina, out of the risks involved in Argentina. And one of the main reasons, I believe, for the success of this amnesty regime was that Argentinians reporting assets out of Argentina were not forced to bring those funds or investments into Argentina. There was no obligation to repatriate. So it was easy to understand why Argentinians, with the difficulties of having non-reported income or assets, were tempted to disclose everything to the tax authorities. The applicable tax was very low. And the key issue, as I was saying, was that they were able to keep the money out of Argentina. Two additional points to highlight here. Income tax, how Argentine income tax applies to Argentine residents. It applies on the worldwide income, which means that income obtained within Argentina and out of Argentina is subject to income tax in Argentina for Argentine residents. The rates, as you might already know, go from 5 to 35%, depending on the total annual net income of the taxpayer. And the other tax that we need to bear in mind is the wealth tax or tax on personal assets, impuesto a los bienes personales in Spanish. It also applies to Argentine residents on worldwide assets, which means that it applies to assets located within Argentina and out of Argentina. And regarding the rates, and this is a key issue for the discussion we are going to have in connection with the impuesto a la riqueza or aporte solidario or solidarity contribution, as you want, is that it was 0.25% as a consequence of the amnesty regime. The same law that created the amnesty regime reduced the rate to 0.25. So it was another reason to report everything to the tax authorities. In the future, Argentine taxpayers thought that the wealth or the assets were going to be subject to this annual tax at a very reduced rate. However, at the end of 2019, a new government started in Argentina, and one of the first things that they did was to send a bill to Congress to amend the tax on personal assets, and it was effectively changed, and the rate was raised to 1.25% for assets located within Argentina and to 2.25% for assets located out of Argentina. So you can see there a dramatic increase of the rate for assets located out of Argentina. Next, please, Susana. Okay, just to also to provide you some context, well, basically information is flowing within and without Argentina. Argentina is receiving, tons of information from other governments thanks to the double tax treaties which are applicable in Argentina. We also have bilateral treaties to exchange information. Argentina is one of the early adopters of standard for automatic exchange of financial information. And in addition, we already have enacted within Argentina certain regulations to comply with the common reporting standard. So basically, there's no way to, there's no chance to hide from the tax authorities in Argentina. And it was also the case back in 2016-17, and that was another reason for Argentinians to accept the amnesty program. Next, please, Susana. Okay, in addition to that, during recent years, Argentina has enacted very effective CFC rules, controlled foreign corporation rules, under which Argentinians holding shares in foreign companies need to report income obtained or profits obtained by those controlled companies, regardless of a distribution of dividends. Basically, there's no chance to defer income tax in Argentina under these CFC rules. There's also a regime to disclose ultimate beneficial owners of local companies. Also, Argentinians need to report shares and participation in foreign entities. Very relevant, there's an information regime under which Argentine residents need to inform the setting up of new trusts out of Argentina. Settlers, beneficiaries, etc., need to report everything to the tax authorities. So there's no way to set up a trust out of Argentina without reporting that trust to the tax authorities. And finally, and this is very new, I'm speaking about last month of last year, a mandatory disclosure regime was enacted whereby Argentine residents need to report to the tax authorities any tax planning scheme, whether local or international. And that obligation not only applies to taxpayers, but also to tax attorneys, accountants, those helping in the implementation of the tax planning scheme. There are many discussions regarding the definition of a tax planning regime, and we are still undergoing this, struggling with understanding the scope of this regime. But basically what I wanted to share with you is the context. We came from an amnesty regime where Argentinians reported almost everything to the tax authorities. Information is flowing both from Argentina and to Argentina, and there are many information obligations for local taxpayers. Next, please, Susana. And now we end up speaking finally about this new solidarity contribution. Everybody knows what the war is going through, the situation with the COVID-19, you know, had a big impact in Argentina, in the rest of the world, but in Argentina, we had a very strong and long lockdown. And since March of 2020, or April, I would say, government started to discuss this possibility of creating a special and extraordinary tax applicable only once for those who are in a position to help others. That's basically what they are saying. And this new tax has been discussed during the whole year 2020 until finally it was enacted and published in the official gazette at the end of December. This emergency contribution, which we believe is really a tax rather than a contribution. They call it contribution just for cosmetic purposes, if you want. But it is a tax. It's applicable only once on assets held as of December 18, 2020. Why that date? Well, because that's the date in which the law was published, okay? So basically, government will take a picture of your assets as of December 18 to 2020, and all those assets are subject to this tax. There is a threshold of 200 million pesos, which is around $2.5 million. How does it work? Well, it only applies this tax to the extent that you reach that threshold. If your assets are worth below that amount, you don't pay the tax. But once you reach that threshold, the total amount of your assets are subject to this tax. Regarding who is obliged to pay this tax and on which of the assets are subject to this tax, well, for Argentine residents, the tax applies on the worldwide assets, which means that assets located in Argentina and abroad are subject to this tax. But there's something to mention here. The law says that the status of residency will be considered as of December 31st of 2019. Why is this? Well, basically because during 2020, there were many Argentinians moving to different countries. Uruguay was one of the favorites countries or destinations. So during 2020, many Argentinians lost their status of Argentine resident for tax purposes. So the law applies, if you want, retroactively and considers your status as of December 31st of 2019, okay? But also applies on the worldwide assets for Argentine nationals, and this is the first time I see this definition, nationals within tax laws, with domicile or residence in non-cooperative or nil or low tax jurisdictions. What is a non-cooperative country or jurisdiction? Where there is a blacklist within the regulations of the income tax law. And what is a nil or low tax jurisdiction? Well, there's a definition in the income tax, but basically it is a jurisdiction where the corporate income tax rate is below 15, okay? Important to know that within the blacklist, we can read Bolivia or Paraguay. So basically, if you had an Argentine national, someone who was born in Argentina and moved to Paraguay, for example, 20 years ago, and of course, he's no longer an Argentine resident for migratory or tax purposes, he has no connections with Argentina, he would fall within this definition. So he or she would be subject to this new tax on all his or her assets owned within Argentina or without Argentina. So this is really something to note. And finally, for those who are non-Argentine residents, the tax only applies on assets located within Argentina through someone who must be appointed as responsible to pay this tax on his or her behalf. Okay, next please, Susana. Now I want to move quickly. I'm sorry if I'm rushing, but I want to use my 20 minutes that were allocated for this part. The valuation of the assets, well, it follows the criteria under the tax on personal assets law. However, no exemptions applicable for that tax will apply for the solidarity contributions. Two very relevant provisions to mention. Contributions to trust are included. This is a very, how could I say, difficult to understand provision. I mean, we understand the reasons behind this provision, but it's at some point very aggressive to try to catch with these tax contributions made by settlers, Argentine resident settlers of foreign trusts, including those trusts organized, for example, 20 years ago, because from a legal perspective, that settler no longer owns those assets. So it's difficult to understand how a tax could be applied on assets that were transferred to a trust for the benefit of a third party 20 years ago. Another very difficult to accept provision, not to understand, to accept provision, is this 80 and 100-day look-back term. Basically, the law says that the tax authorities could review what the taxpayer did during 180 days before the enactment of the law, before December 18, 2020, to decide whether or not the taxpayer made something to evade the tax. It is very difficult to predict how this provision will be applied, because the law grants the authority for the tax authorities to understand what was the intent of that scheme or transaction made by the taxpayer. For example, a donation to his or her children of this taxpayer would be under review of this provision. Okay. Well, very quickly, the rates for local assets go from 2 to 3.5%. Remember that this is in addition to the tax on personal assets that I was discussing before. And for assets located abroad, there is an aggravated rate that goes from 3 to 5.25%. And this depends on the total value of the assets subject to the tax. However, Argentine residents with assets located abroad have the chance to repatriate 30%, at least 30% of their financial assets. They have 60 days to do that, to apply to the whole amount of assets, the rate applicable for local assets. So basically, there is a higher rate for assets located abroad, but there is a way to avoid that higher rate by repatriating into Argentina and investing those funds into specific things or financial assets that the law and the regulations provide. What is the deadline to pay this tax? March 30, 2021. Why not the end of the month? Because March, as you might know, has 31 days. We don't know. The deadline is March 30, and that's the day where taxpayers need to submit the tax return and pay the tax. Next, please, Susana, and I'm almost finishing, and we'll be open for questions. Well, together with this law of creation of this contribution, a regulation was issued and an information regime was created whereby Argentine taxpayers need to report the value of the assets of their assets as of March 20 of 2020. This is because that is presumably the day in which the 180 days term starts. Basically, the tax authorities want to know what was the picture at the beginning of that term, to compare that picture with the picture of March, I'm sorry, with the picture of December 18 of 2020, to see if there was a decrease in the value of the assets, and to see if that provision whereby the tax authorities could presume an intention to evade should be applied. Okay. Well, and there's also an obligation for those who are not subject to this tax to report the value of the assets back in 2019, in 2018, and also the value of the assets as of December 18, 2020. So basically, the tax authorities want to have the evolution of the value of the assets of each taxpayer, whether subject to the tax or not, to the extent those thresholds that are described here in this slide are reached, to see if that provision whereby the intent to evade applies must be applied. Okay. Now there's also an extension of the term to pay. Yesterday it was made official that the tax authorities will provide an installment plan, so taxpayers don't need to pay the tax on December 30. They will be able to pay only 20% and have 5 monthly installments to pay the rest of the tax. So they are providing a financial help for taxpayers to pay this tax. And last one, Susana, I think. Well, needless to say that there are many arguments for a challenge of this tax, and taxpayers are, thinking by these days, and that is my experience, whether to pay this tax or not. The tax could be, this is absolutely from a theoretical point of view, because this needs to be reviewed on a case-by-case basis. I cannot tell you that this tax is confiscatory in general. It depends on the assets and the value of the assets, the value of the profits derived from those assets, the activity of the taxpayer, the total situation. It is not possible to make such a conclusion in theory. Okay, I'm not saying this tax is not confiscatory. I'm just saying that it needs to be addressed on a case-by-case basis. You could say that debts are not considered for purposes of determining the total value of the assets subject to tax, and that could be confiscatory. The provision under which transfers to tax are, if you want, disregarded, and those assets transferred to the trust must be included for the calculation of the tax, could be confiscatory, because at the end of the day, you pay tax on something that you don't own, no longer own. Some people believe that this tax violates equality, because once you reach the threshold of 200 million pesos, the whole amount is subject to tax. The whole amount of your assets is subject to tax, whereby you could find a guy with assets for 199 million pesos and is not subject to tax at all. You could also hold that the rates applicable for foreign assets is violating the equality principle. You could also argue that there are no provisions for married taxpayers, because sometimes the total amount of assets is subject in the head of one of them, but the reality is that the assets were acquired between both spouses. So this is something that is also being discussed by these days. Finally, you could also hold that the retroactive provisions for purposes of considering the residency of the taxpayer are not acceptable, and to sum up, this tax to the tax on personal assets also violates the property right that you have. So these are the things that are being discussed by these days. But finally, what if I don't want to pay the tax? I'm a taxpayer, and I believe that some or all of the arguments that I was describing in general apply to my case. What if I decide not to pay the tax? What would be the consequences? Well, if the tax authorities come and make a claim, as in the case of any other claim, interest would be accrued, and I would have to pay the total amount of tax plus interest. It is also almost sure that the tax authorities will apply a fine for not paying the tax. What about foreclosures? Could the tax authorities impose or request from a judge such a thing? The answer is yes, of course. During the process, even if you challenge an assessment made by the tax authorities, you could suffer a foreclosure. You could also be subject to a criminal case. And if there is time and people are interested, we could discuss a little bit about that. People are also afraid of other consequences, such as, for example, and this is not something new, it happened in the past, you could find lists of people that decided not to pay this tax in the media. That involves a reputational risk rather than a legal risk, but it's also something that is being discussed and considered by taxpayers nowadays, because as you already know, we have 3 weeks for the deadline of this tax, and taxpayers are still thinking, and many of them are still deciding what to do with this tax. I would stop here and be open to questions if you want after the other guys made their discussion. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you, Walter, very much. Yes, please, everybody post your questions in the Q&A section, and then Walter, Marco, Raul, and Maria Laura will be happy to answer that. I think everybody needs a full picture before they ask the questions. And we'll move on to our next speakers. Thank you very much, Walter. I think it was very clear, at least for me. I'm not an expert on this at all, and I could follow what you were explaining. So thank you very much for this. Okay, and give me 1 second, please. Okay. So I'm very happy to introduce Raul and Maria Laura as our next speakers. Raul is the Director of Private Wealth at Vistra, and the team is based in Miami. He particularly focuses on family businesses and their advisors from Latin America. Prior to joining Vistra's London office in December 2017, he spent time in New York City and Frankfurt with a leading global service firm, attending to clients and financial intermediaries from the Latin America area, the United States, and Europe. Previously, he lived in Madrid and multiple jurisdictions in Latin America. Raul holds a double master's in financial consulting and wealth management, as well as international business studies. He speaks fluent English, Spanish, and German, and he's a member of STEP. Maria Laura Ferrer is the Executive Director at Vistra, and as Director of the LATAM team, Maria Laura is responsible for the management of structures of clients from different jurisdictions. Before joining Vistra in 2013, Maria Laura worked for 4 years as Relationship Manager for a trust company in Barcelona, where she was responsible for the implementation of international corporate structures and the management of a portfolio of clients. Maria Laura is a member of the Venezuelan Bar and a member of the Society of Trust and Estate Practitioners, TEP, and she holds a law degree from the Universidad Metropolitana of Caracas and a master's degree of international trade from the Universidad Pompeu Fabra of Barcelona. So thank you very much for joining us. Give me 1 minute. I'm going to be sharing your presentation. You are patient with me. Let me find this. All right, so let me just, okay. Maria Laura and Raul, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Susana. It's great to be with you this, for me, morning time here in Miami. And I think Walter very clearly and excellently set the stage for us. We sort of want to follow on to that, giving a bit of an overview of the solution, the trust solution that we mostly work with for Argentine tax residents, even though, as we understood from Walter, there is a lot of moving parts at the moment still, and it's even being challenged, as Walter was explaining, what happens when legal ownership has been officially transferred, not even probably recently, but even in situations where it might have been 2 decades ago. That said, we can go into questions following this. Again, what we want to do is briefly describe the concept of an irrevocable discretionary trust, which we still tend to implement for Argentine tax residents. I'm going to give a brief overview of how that arrangement works. Then my colleague Maria Laura is going to dive into further specifics of the structure and the governing laws that may apply to the structure. And with that, we are open to question. Susanna, if you could kindly sort of move on to the next slide. Yeah, just a very brief introduction here for the ones that do not know us. So far, we are an international group of trust practitioners, provide trust services, corporate services. In addition to that, also fund administration services to our clients. We sort of dotted around the globe with over 4,700 employees globally, present in over 45 jurisdictions with over 80 offices. We do not operate a presence in Argentina. Yeah, again, I'm based here in Miami. My colleague Maria Laura Ferrer is based in Zurich, Switzerland. What we do, and that brings me to the next slide, what we do specifically for our private wealth clients internationally and globally is to help them create and build on their wealth by access to international capital markets, or the opportunity to expand their business or family business, as often in Latin America, outside of the region. Also, and I think that is very relevant to what we will be discussing in just a few moments, is how to preserve wealth and ensure that wealth is protected, and how wealth is transferred on an intergenerational basis for families. Also, we keep oversight, and that brings us into the relationship with advisors like Walter. Today, we sort of keep oversight over the family wealth and monitor that very closely in conjunction with other advisors from our networks. With that, Susanna, I would like to move on to what I outlined in the beginning, irrevocable discretionary trust. We have tried here to keep the concept as basic as possible, as we understand that there is quite a diverse audience listening in today. So as you can see from the chart here, we have the trust arrangement in the middle. We have a settlor, in our case, a fiscal resident in Argentina, contributing the assets to the trust. The trust holds an underlying asset holding entity that in turn owns the assets, and the trustee typically assumes legal ownership of the assets and would then make distributions to the beneficiaries. As a next step, what I wanted to do very briefly here is sort of speak to how the trust structure works once it gets established, and then a couple of considerations to bear in mind for when the trust structure is sort of fully operational and so to speak is beginning its lifetime. As a first point here, when the trust structure is established and legal ownership is transferred, there's typically no gift tax here when the settlor contributes the assets through a deed of gift to the trust. As we're talking here about an irrevocable and fully discretionary trust, what is important is that when it comes to investment powers of the underlying entity, that these cannot be delegated to the settlor without any sort of adverse tax implications for the settlor. They must instead be delegated to a qualified third party. In that case, it would most likely be a qualified and regulated investment professional, or again, assigned to the underlying entities, a banking provider via a typically discretionary, or in this case, definitely discretionary mandate. That sort of sets the scene for the establishment side of things. When it comes to the lifetime of the trust, once the arrangement has been formalized, income and capital gains tax derived within the trust structure are free of tax. tax deferral also applies to income and capital gains tax on the underlying company level, which we see here on the structure chart. However, and that's important to mention here, beneficiaries may be taxed upon the receipt of distributions, and we can come to that, and hopefully my colleague Maria Laura can also speak to that in a moment. As a final point here from my side, and Walter has alluded to that on several occasions as part of his presentation, there is a trust reporting obligation on General Rule 3312 from 2012, when Argentina and the FTA from Argentina sort of became an early adopter to OECD regulations, and also brought foreign trusts into the reporting requirement, which is typically done online. With that, Susanna, I would like to give a few moments to Maria Laura as well to dive a little bit deeper into the structure before we can proceed with questions.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Raul. I would like to comment a bit more in detail of what you have perfectly mentioned about the trust structure for Argentinian clients, for which we strongly believe that the trust, the irrevocable structure will continue being as succession planning tool besides an asset protection for Argentinian clients, and that this tax that is being new for all Argentinian residents is just a one time, and that hopefully afterwards we can continue planning as we have been in the last years or decades, besides the amendments or modifications to the income tax law and so on. So what is important is that there is an effective transfer of the property to the trust, a contribution, and not only that this is properly documented, but it also needs to have a certain date, which means that the document by itself, fully dated, is not enough for the tax authorities. It needs to be legalized and apostille. So the formalities became lately very important to support and to make sure that the structure is correct from the local point of view. Besides, for the trust law perspective, with the sole signature and the witnesses, it will be valid. But we need to also comply with the local regulations if we want to achieve a proper trust structure. So it's also important the discretion on the trustee on this management of the assets, and as Raul was mentioning, the appointment of a third party in order to properly manage the assets as an independent advisor or a discretionary mandate to the bank or the financial institution who is holding or custodying the assets. It's also important to have an independent trustee. As you know, it is or no, but it's possible to have a person as a trustee, or is possible to have a private trust company. But in these cases, and if we want this to work from an Argentinian perspective, it needs to be an independent trust company, such as Vistra or many others that are around. And it's also important that the trust is clearly set as irrevocable. It cannot be a revocable trust or understood or a second instrument where the client retains a power to in somehow receive the funds from the trust, because if this is the case, then the client or the structure will be deemed owned or transparent by the client, and therefore subject to taxes in Argentina. It's also important to consider that while appointing a protector or a protector committee, it needs to be someone independent from the settler. Best of a scenario is not a family member. We know and we understand sometimes this is difficult to fulfill because of the importance of this role in the trust structure, but it's important to know that they are professional protectors that could also serve and provide the necessary substance to the structure in order to be able to comply with a proper structure. As you may heard, there are many trust law jurisdictions which are very good. Sometimes it only depends on what the client needs or what the client is looking for, along with his or her tax advisor. But we strongly believe that, for example, jurisdictions such as in the UK or New Zealand or even the States are very strong. And has a good protection, not only for during the lifetime of the trust, but also in case there is a conflict between the beneficiaries and so on. We need to always be supported by the case laws and understand that this also is relevant not only today but in the future. It's good that from the Argentina point of view, the jurisdictions that we can use is very open and have many options, because the country has accepted as cooperative jurisdictions many countries. So this will be from the trust setup and formalities point of view, what is important and so on, and we remain open for any questions and or comments on this.
Thank you very much. Okay, if we could have everybody there, excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you, Maria Laura. Thank you, Raul and Walter. I think he has been very clear. We have a few questions here, but please don't, if you have any other additional questions to pose, please, I mean, you still have time to do that. I have a question from Sol here. For non-residents, the threshold applies only to the value of their local assets, correct?
Yes, that is correct. That is a threshold. Yes, correct.
Perfect.
So just to give you an example, we have some, I would say, clients that are non-Argentine residents because they moved to other countries during 2020, and their assets located in Argentina don't reach that threshold. So basically, we have a conflict here. We have a non-Argentine resident that was Argentine resident as of December 31st, 2020. However, the total, the value of the assets located in Argentina don't reach that threshold. So from the perspective of that taxpayer, he is not obliged to pay this tax because the provision under which the status of residency is considered as of December 31st of 2019 should not be applicable. So just to give you an example of how the threshold applies. For the tax authorities, this guy will be subject to tax on the worldwide assets because it is considered as an Argentine resident for purposes of this tax. However, he believes he's a non-Argentine resident, and the threshold means that he's not subject to the tax at all, okay? So that's the challenge that we have here, and that is the discussion that we are going to have.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I have a question here in Spanish. I'm going to translate. A contributor opts to evaluate their shares according to the balance to the 31st of December 2019. His particular account in this society, how is this valued? Is the balance pending or important to the day on the 31st of December 2019 or the 18th of December 2020?
I can address that one. I mean, this is a very specific question, and we need to explain before or to understand the question that the law, in the case of taxpayers with participation in the equity of companies, provides the option to assess the value of that participation as of December 18, 2020. For which the company needs to prepare a specific balance sheet, or to apply the last balance sheet of the company, or the last one prepared by the company, which would be December 31st, 2019. So the taxpayer has the option. And I think the question is, well, how do you assess the value of this particular account of that taxpayer if you apply or consider the balance sheet closed as of 2019? I would say that you should apply the valuation or to assess the value of the special account or the particular account of that taxpayer as of December 31st, 2019. You have to be coherent with that. So you have the option to consider the value at the end of 2019 or to prepare a special balance sheet. If you go for the first option, you should be applying that value for all purposes. That's my understanding of this provision. But again, this is very specific. And it is at some point crazy that the law takes the date December 18, 2020, because companies don't have a balance sheet as of that date. I mean, that's why the regulations provided for that option to consider the last balance sheet closed by the company before that date. Okay.
And thank you very much. And we invite everybody who's here today to contact speakers directly, and we are happy to make introductions if you want to, go deeper into these questions. I think I have another question here. Trusts. Is there any threshold for the structure to make sense bearing in mind initial and annual costs?
Yeah, Maria Laura, you want to comment, or I'm happy to comment if not. Yeah. Yes, I mean this is probably the same answer as Walter was giving. It's a bit on a case-by-case basis, but typically we're looking at operational costs. Again, depending on how sophisticated the arrangement is, it would probably be challenging to justify an arrangement with the operational cost for the lower end of the threshold, saying that someone is considering an arrangement internationally with the professional trustees like us for an amount, let's say, close to $1 million. That might be a bit tricky to operate. That would be my humble view on it. Maria Laura, you want to add to that?
Yes, it is correct, Raul. Not only because of the trust administration and responsibilities of the trustee, but the increasing regulations. As you may heard, we have now substance requirement in the offshore entities. We have to produce the balance sheet, which needs to be also apostille for Argentinian tax purposes in order to have the necessary supporting documents in case of an inspection. So all this work and that we do and we look after needs to be properly done. Therefore, we think that it makes more sense with a bit higher or after passing the $1 million patrimony of the settler.
Excellent, thank you very much. I have one more question. A question to Walter. How do you think tax authorities will enforce payment of this tax to settlers who contributed assets to a trust years ago? What is your opinion on irrevocable discretionary as a tax planning tool for Argentinian tax residents?
Okay, this is a beautiful question too. I love this discussion, and of course, we will have to discuss this before the courts. To be honest, I don't think that provision will be, how could I say, successfully applied, because from a legal perspective, the legal ownership of the property transfers to the trust to the extent that this is a trust which is irrevocable, non-controlled by the settler or by the beneficiaries. It's discretionary in terms that the trustee is in charge of deciding what to do with the assets being transferred. I think, I mean, from a legal perspective, it is very difficult to argue that there is, as we call, ability to pay, capacidad contributiva in the head of the settler. This is a guy, I mean, let's go to an extreme situation. The guy had $10 million, is about to die, decides to set up a trust and transfers to the trust almost everything but, let's say, $1,000. How could you say that that guy is in control, has the ability to pay this new tax created by this law? I mean, the guy has already transferred the legal ownership of the assets. He's not in control of the trust. It is irrevocable. He cannot call back those assets and be in control of them. So I think that at the end of the day, the courts should rule in favor of the taxpayer, rule in favor of not applying that provision. So if the question is, will the tax authorities try to enforce that provision? The answer is probably yes, because that is their job. They are not in a position to decide whether or not to apply a law. If it is a law, I mean, if I was an employee of the tax authorities and I am in charge of auditing a taxpayer and I see a trust, regardless of the features of that trust, I need to try to collect taxes from that trust. Do you see? I mean, I'm not in a position to decide whether that provision in the law is constitutional or not, is acceptable for a court or not. I need to apply the law. So at the end of the day, we need to think what a court would say about this provision. And that is when I say it is difficult for me to believe that a court will rule in favor of the payment of the tax in this scenario. And this is not new, by the way. I mean, Argentinians setting up trusts abroad, discretionary, non-control, irrevocable is something that has been in the market for a while. It has been used by local taxpayers, you know, for planning purposes, succession planning purposes, tax planning purposes, if you want. And Maria Laura and Raul can explain a little bit more about that, or already did that. And they were, they proved that this is a tool that works from an Argentinian perspective. So the discussion about, you have another discussion whether under the substance over the form or the economic reality, the settlor is still in control of the assets. That's another discussion. If you find under the economic reality principle that there was, in reality, this is controlled by the settlor, the reality is that it is not irrevocable. The reality is that the beneficiaries are in control of the trust. That's a different story, okay? But based on the question, if this is a pure irrevocable, discretionary trust, well organized by Maria Laura and Raul, for example, the courts should rule in favor of the taxpayer and the tax should not apply. That is what I believe, okay? That's my opinion.
Maria Laura and Raul, I mean, any comments on that? We love being controversial.
The point mentioned by Walter is very good. Indeed, there are several case law in Argentina around trust structures. One of the latest, Walter, correct me if I'm wrong, is the Fiorotto case, where the court especially says that if the trust is properly set and properly documented, so everyone can do a trust, everyone can do a structure, but if not properly done, it won't suit the purpose and it will not be recognized locally. So this is important, that when you are planning is correctly done with a professional and reputable trustee.
Can I expand a little bit about this subject, which is, you know, very relevant. The law doesn't distinguish between the law, I mean, the Aporte Solidario doesn't distinguish between revocable or non-revocable, okay? The law only says that assets transferred to trusts are also subject to this tax. My understanding and the way I think the provision in the law should be read is that, or read, should be that it refers to revocable trusts, because those are the only ones that could be subject to this tax, or in other words, the assets being transferred to a trust which is revocable or which is in control of the settlor, those assets are the only assets that should be considered as still owned by the settlor. In fact, under the income tax law, those trusts are, if you want, disregarded for income tax purposes because the settlor is still in control, okay? Therefore, I think the only way to understand or to correctly understand the provision in the law is that it refers to revocable trusts. If I have an irrevocable, non-controlled trust, my understanding is that the law should be understood as excluding those assets from this new tax. However, this is not the understanding of the tax authorities up to what we know, I mean, as far as we know up to now. This is very informal, but the tax authorities have already explained that they believe that all kind of trusts are subject to this provision. But again, at the end of the day, the courts will decide which interpretation of this provision should apply.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that. And we have one last question. What exchange rate is to be taken into consideration for the threshold if is it BNA buyer rate?
Yes, that is correct. And at the end of the day, the aplicativo, which is the system on the website of the tax authorities through which you need to submit your tax return, will apply automatically the exchange rate. It is already known, it is 82 point something pesos for each dollar. So we already know that. But by the way, at the beginning of the discussions in connection with this new tax back in March 2020, the date in which the assets to be considered for purposes of this tax was December 31st, 2019. Okay, the discussion took the whole year, and finally the law was published and the picture is taken December 18, 2020. But it was 2019 at the beginning. And by those times, the exchange rate was around 60. So deferring the discussion and deferring the enactment of the law derived in the inclusion of many new taxpayers who are considering 60 pesos as the exchange rate were not subject to tax. And I'm referring to the assets or let's say financial assets held out of Argentina. For purposes of the conversion, the exchange rate was 60. So it was, I would say, more difficult to reach the threshold of 200 million pesos. The threshold didn't change, but what changed is the applicable exchange rate, which went from 60 to 82 point something. I'm trying to say that the number of taxpayers subject to this tax is bigger than it was at the beginning of the discussion of the draft law. Okay, so there were many taxpayers who are taxpayers now who were not taxpayers under the original draft law, which considered the exchange rate 60 because the deadline or the picture was taken at the end of 2019.
Okay, we have one last question. We're running out of time, but thank you very much for posting all these questions. Walter, do you think an Argentinian beneficiary of an irrevocable discretionary trust can be taxed on wealth tax although they haven't received any distribution from the trust? This discussion arose after last amendments to local wealth tax.
My answer to that question is no. I don't think the beneficiaries should be subject to the tax on personal assets. Those provisions in the tax on personal assets law, which were introduced a couple of years ago, basically say that the beneficiary of a foreign trust need to recognize the value of the right for purposes of the tax on personal assets. I would say the value of the assets or the right under the trust, if any. So I'm saying if I am the beneficiary of a trust and I'm not receiving anything from the trust, but an expectation to receive something when, for example, the settlor passes away, I only have an expectation to receive something in the future. How much is worth that expectation? Well, I could say nothing because it is subject to a condition. So my position is that I don't have anything. I have an expectation, the same expectation I could have for purposes of this tax under the inheritance rules for the assets owned by my parents without a trust, you see. So this is just an expectation subject to a condition. So my position is that you don't have anything there. So the provision in the law says you have to evaluate or to consider the value of your right, or the value of, yeah, you have to include the value of your right under that trust. And I would say, if any, if there's no value there, you don't have to recognize anything. And that is what I believe.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much to the three of you for being with us today. Thank you to everybody who logged in and joined us this afternoon. We are going to be sharing the presentations and the recordings, but I insist, if there's any questions that you would like to pose directly to any of the speakers, please don't hesitate, contact us, and we'll be happy to make introductions. So from the British Argentine Chamber of Commerce, I want to thank you, everybody, and have a good weekend. And hopefully this will be somehow resolved to the poor taxpayers who have to pay so much money. So thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.